One time I had the opportunity to chant while Prabhupada was present in the kirtan. Sometimes he would have devotees chanting kirtan rather than him doing it in the early days. So I was chosen, I was able to chant, and I was always trying to be humble in whatever way I thought was humble. And so when I was leading, I was chanting not very loudly, and in order to put myself forward as some great kirtan leader. And Prabhupada shouted at me, said, "Chant loudly." So we've learned over the years that, and Prabhupada would say very clearly that boldly preaching was an act of humility, because it was the positive portion of humility. That if you preached loudly, then that took care of humility. One time I was in the temple room, it was after prasadam. In the early days, devotees would take prasadam. The prasadam would be cooked upstairs in Prabhupada's apartment and brought downstairs, and devotees would eat in the temple. We had these grass mats that we'd lay out, and plates was a really cacophony of plates that were gotten at thrift stores and so on. They were porcelain plates, nothing matched. And so the plates had to be washed afterwards. So I was in the temple, and the plates were all in the sink. And in the temple, this was a storefront that was opened up, and in the back there was a little bathroom, and outside a little sink, and the plates were all piled up there, and the plates were not washed. And I was in the temple alone. I might have been chanting japa or reading, I don't remember, I just happened to be there, and who comes in? Prabhupada walks in and offered my obeisances. And then he saw in the sink all these dishes, and he said, why aren't these dishes done? And of course I was left standing. I didn't know what to say, but he said, well, if no one's going to do it, then I'll do it. Well, naturally, of course, I got with the program. But Prabhupada was prepared to do that, just wash the dishes. I always tried to preach to my parents, or at least, get into arguments with my parents, especially my father. My mother didn't like to argue. My father was a real debater. He was really into politics, and so he just loved a good debate. But I remember as a child lying in bed and in the dark, and then thinking what it was like to die, and imagining myself in a coffin, sitting, thinking that there I was dead, and I got so scared. It was so frightening. So I guess so always I had this image of, somewhere in my psyche about being afraid of death, and probably that helped me to come to Krishna consciousness eventually. But I used that on my parents, my mother. I said, trying to, aren't you afraid of death? And my mother said, no, I'm not afraid of dying. So that really confused me. How could anybody admit that they weren't afraid of dying? So one lecture, after the lecture, and had nothing, this question I wanted to ask Prabhupada had nothing to do with the lecture. So I said, I think maybe Prabhupada might have been speaking about death and fear of death. And so I said, Prabhupada, I asked my mother about that, she said, no, that she's not afraid of death. And he said, they may say they're not afraid of death, but you give somebody a gun and say, okay, go ahead. But so actually, it's easy to say, but actually everyone is afraid of death. Even in my mother's later years, and she was actually very receptive to Krishna consciousness, very favorable. But still, in her later years, she was about to fall. If any problem, she was always fearful, and even she would express a lot of times going on a plane, that she's so afraid. So really, when you get down to it, everyone is afraid of dying. One time in a letter I wrote to Prabhupada, basically I was pretty obsessed with sex life early on in my life, and I had an honest question which I wanted to ask, but it was very embarrassing, and I was wondering, looking at Krishna and trying to understand Krishna. I was wondering, well, did Krishna have genitals? Because we see his picture, we see his body, and so I was really wondering. But I thought, wow, that is a really embarrassing thing to think about. But I thought that, well, I had to get this off my chest because I was just inquisitive. I was always very inquisitive. Prabhupada one time thanked me for my inquisitiveness in a letter, which I had filled, probably a letter that filled with 10 questions, being one after another. So I wrote a letter to Prabhupada, and I asked him, please, forgive me for this outrageous question, but I asked him, does Krishna have genitals? And he wrote back a letter and said that, he said, no, it's not an outrageous question. Any sincere question is welcome. He said, and you should know it, that yes, Krishna has genitals. If we have got genitals, then Krishna has got genitals, but his genitals are not like ours. He does not need his genital to impregnate. He can impregnate with any part of his body. He can impregnate with his eyes and so on. He said, but he was explaining that as aspiring devotees, we should be starting from the feet of Krishna and not go up, just like we also start from the beginning of the Bhagavatam, which is the feet of Krishna, and we don't go on until we've progressed. So it was just as a result of trying to understand something more than I was actually qualified to understand. So then the initiates were, we were chosen. I was going to get a Brahminical initiation in Boston. We went there. It was a few of us, and probably anywhere from 4 or 6 people were getting initiation. We were sitting around the fire, and there happened to be this professor there. There seemed to be always some professor who was somewhat favorable and was trying to be cultivated one way or another. And he was some professor of Sanskrit or Indology in some fashion. And he was there sitting behind us around the fire. And the grains were being passed around. And I thought to be a nice boy. And when it came around, I asked him, I passed the plate to get him to throw. And I thought that's what was being done at the time. Everybody was throwing grains in, whether they were being initiated or not. I think that's what was happening at that time. And so, to be polite, I turned around and offered him some grains, and Prabhupada shouted at me. Boy, it felt like a thunderbolt. It felt like a thunderbolt. What are you doing? Don't do that. I don't remember what he said, but it was clear. It was a thunderbolt. So the grains were getting passed around, and it came around again to me, or around my area, and he motioned for somebody, either me or somebody else, to go offer the grains to this professor to throw in. So, I see the look on your face, and that was the look on my face. What is this about? I had no idea. I kept on questioning year after year. I would wonder what happened there. And I don't, to this day it's a matter of interpretation. My guess was that this person was really Prabhupada's equal, not my equal. I was just a minor little brahmachari. way out of the league of this man, at least etiquette-wise, and Prabhupada wasn't. And so if it was to be done, it was to be done by Prabhupada, not by me. In the early days in New York City, as everyone knows, it gets very hot there and humid. And devotees would sometimes go without their shirts, or I'd like to go without my shirt. And I knew there was some vanity involved in that. So I was trying to be a good devotee, and I asked Prabhupada, is it all right to go without a shirt? Thinking from the vain point of view that maybe that's not proper. And he said, well, he didn't answer it in that way. It had nothing to do with that. He said, no, you should not put yourself at the mercy of the sun. That was very interesting. This is way back in 1967, 68, when there wasn't really that kind of knowledge about how detrimental the sun was, but Prabhupada said like that. Oh, one thing that really impressed me, Prabhupada got a stroke early on, just not too long after I joined, and I wonder what that was. But anyway, he got a stroke in early 67 or early to mid 67. And then he went out to, he was in the hospital in Manhattan. Devotees just didn't know what to do. Everybody was certainly very scared. So he was in the hospital, and we would go occasionally. Kirtananda was taking care of him at that time. Devotees would go occasionally. I went one time, and Prabhupada's one side of his body was paralyzed, so with lip was drooping on that side, and arm was paralyzed, and so he was having devotees massage that side of his body. I got a chance to massage his arm, and they were feeding him there vegetarian food, but they were feeding him just boiled vegetables, steamed or boiled vegetables, and he really didn't like that. And he would try to spice it up with some salt and pepper, but really didn't. He wasn't satisfied. One time he gave it to us. He gave it, and so after, but he didn't, so he didn't like it there. He eventually, I believe that Brahmananda at one point snuck him out because they didn't want him to leave, and Brahmananda just, got him out of the hospital there, and then he came back, and when he went to recuperate on the West Coast, that was the arrangement, and he came back, and on his way back to India. So he was recuperating a little bit, but eventually was going to go back to India, which was very scary because we didn't know if we were going to see him again. And he came into the temple. I remember he came into the temple, and he was very weak, walking with a cane, walking very slowly. And he came in to the temple, walked up to a picture of, we had the disciplic succession pictures up, his spiritual master Bhakti, and also then Bhakti Vinod Thakur, and maybe Gorkashore Das Babaji Maharaj. So he walked up to the picture of his spiritual master and slowly got down on his knees and down, did full dandavats. This is when he was it was just very impressive to see the kind of devotion that he had, even while he was so sick. I think what really impressed me about Prabhupada was his infallibility. From early on, I mean, really, when I first met Prabhupada and he came to New York and they were arranging engagements for Prabhupada to speak, before I could even ask really intelligent questions, I would hear questions, challenging questions from people, and I would think, oh wow, is he going to be able? And sure enough, Prabhupada answered. I've never seen Prabhupada defeated, ever.
Je anilo true